This is Archvale, a top-down 2D action RPG with a good amount of classic Zelda influence and the like, but also more than a little bit of modern game influences as well, with stuff like Terraria, Enter the Gungeon coming to mind, because this game focuses on bullet hell elements from the very beginning. All of the bosses, all of the enemies, all of the areas, everything. It is definitely a sort of 2D bullet hell experience, although this is not a roguelite, I should mention, just to get that out of the way. There's no permadeath or anything like that. It is a classic sort of, I guess, more open world in the old school Zelda style. But the way the progression works actually reminds me very heavily of something like Terraria, and I have a feeling that that was actually a direct influence because of the way that this game works. It might not look like Terraria, but it does work a lot like it in terms of how the structure will be very familiar to you if you've played something like Terraria, despite this being a very different style of game up front, because it's mostly focused on going through various biomes, each biome having its own unique enemies and of course its own ore to harvest. And once you harvest this ore, you can create, just go back to town and craft a certain number of basic new armor and weaponry that's just based on that ore. And then the enemies of each biome will also drop their own unique enemy drops that you can then combine with all of that stuff to make more exotic, powerful stuff, and then by the time you're sort of at the end of that biome, you'll be decked out with the most powerful armor and weapons that you could find and craft from that particular area, and then you'll be ready for the next biome. So it definitely has a very familiar structure, and it actually does a really good job of keeping you interested the whole time, in my opinion. I actually basically 100% of this game. I went through the whole thing, went through every single square on the map and got everything that I could and beat out the bosses and completed everything, and it took me roughly about 9 or 10 hours or so to do so, and it actually felt like a really good 9 or 10 hours because none of it felt grindy or unnecessary or frustrating. It all felt quite well paced all the way through, but more on all of that later. So first off, how does all of this actually work? Well, there's quite a bit of build variety for you to choose from, for one, because there are no skill points or skill trees or anything like that, which means that the entirety of your build is your equipment, your weapons that you have on your hotbar, as well as the armor that you're equipped with. Again, very much like Terraria. In fact, all of your sort of build-defining stuff is the actual equipment that you're geared up with, and you can change that to swap it out on the fly anytime you want, and you don't have to worry about respeccing skill points or anything like that to change your build, which I do appreciate for a game like this. It makes it very accessible, while also still having a good amount of challenge, because the bullet hell patterns do actually get pretty intense later on in the game. But the main way it works is that the world is split into many screens, and each set of screens belongs to a specific biome, and that biome will have its own enemies, as well as its own resource to harvest, and eventually a town and a dungeon. The town unlocks different things depending on the town. Basically, every time you visit a town, the two different types of stores will stock new stuff. You will also be able to unlock a new bank, because you lose money when you die. You lose half of the money that you're currently carrying when you die, and then you get sent back to the last goddess statue that you prayed at. And no, you cannot go back to the area you died and get your money back. That's the first thing I tried, just to check, but no, it's gone for good when you lose it. So you want to unlock these banks, because the more banks you unlock, the more money you can store in the banks, so you can go back to town and store all of your money and keep it safe that way. Every town will also have some NPCs to talk to, although there are no side quests really, and an anvil that allows you to craft all of the game's craftable stuff. From armor to weapons, there's a ton of different things to craft, combining the various ores and materials that you can find in each biome, as well as all the enemy drops and sometimes unique stuff that you can find in chests to make new gear for yourself. And eventually your goal is to explore each of these biomes as much as possible, going to all of the various screens that make it up, and then eventually finding the dungeon. The main goal of each biome is to get to the dungeon and complete it. And at the end of the dungeon will be a boss battle themed to that particular area, as well as a shard of the big, huge arch itself that the game is named after. There are several different shards to find, and once you get them all, you can actually access the final boss fight. So it's a relatively simple concept, just find the dungeons, explore the world, beat the dungeons, fight the bosses. But it gets a lot more complicated when you realize that there's a ton of bullet hell stuff in between you and success, and you're going to need to craft all sorts of powerful pieces of equipment to actually survive the journey, each biome having its own set of different things to craft and find in it, and eventually unlocking your way to higher levels of power to allow you to survive more difficult biomes and more difficult dungeons. This means that the game itself has a really pleasingly open feel overall, because it never really railroads you to doing any one particular area first, except for the very early area, which is still pretty much non-linear, to be honest. You can pretty much do the game in any order that you want. You can go to any of the dungeons in any order that you find them and just explore around at your leisure and do whatever, basically. So there's only a couple of areas that are sort of locked out to you by progression, one of which you have to basically have a certain amount of DPS to get past this target that unlocks the vines to the jungle area. So that one is sort of locked out to a certain amount of progression because you have to be at least powerful enough to kill that target before it heals itself. And the other one is the sort of final flaming area that's quite difficult. That one actually requires you to stand up to a big wave of bullets and just take the damage and not die. So you have to have a certain amount of health and defense in order to actually survive that. But other than those two areas, everywhere else in the world is just a place that you can venture to at your own leisure and to complete in whatever order you want. Exploration in this game is not only very heavily encouraged, but also very well rewarded. There are tons of things to find in the world aside from just the dungeons to progress. As you explore every screen on the world map, you'll find things like power-ups for your character, like making your bombs more powerful or giving yourself more attack. You'll also find new statues, which is useful because, for one, every statue that you rest at can be fast traveled to later. So this means if you need to farm a certain resource, you can fast travel back to the area much quicker instead of having to walk all the way there, so that's nice. But also, every time you find a sort of dilapidated shrine in the wild, you restore it to a fully working order, and when you do that, you get a permanent +1 defense, no matter what else you're wearing. So this means as you explore the world, you'll be able to take more and more damage because you'll be getting more and more defense that is independent of whatever armor you've crafted for yourself at the time. So this is useful because even though it's only one defense at a time, there are a ton of these wild shrines to find, so it adds up very quickly and means that exploration just flat out makes you stronger and is a very good idea. You'll also occasionally find chests with new pieces of gear in them. Oftentimes these are extremely useful to find because not only is the gear itself quite good, but also a lot of times this is the only way you can get these particular pieces of gear, and they're often used in other recipes using that biome's materials to make even more powerful stuff. So you definitely want to find these chests because they allow you to create all sorts of more powerful stuff later on. You'll also find these challenge shrine thingies, which are very difficult, oftentimes like bullet hell challenges, where you have to just dodge all of the bullets coming at you in 3 different waves of increasing difficulty, and you cannot fight back. You can't attack, you just have to dodge and not get hit a single time. And if you're able to complete all 3 waves of each of these challenges, you get a badge. And the badge system is something that allows you to sort of accentuate your build. These are very clearly inspired by things like Hollow Knight's pins. You have a certain amount of maximum capacity that you can equip at any given time, and each one of these badges takes a different amount of that capacity to equip, so you can have a different amount of them at any given time. And every time you visit a new town, the badge merchant there will be selling you 1 additional extra capacity, so by the end of the game you can have like 9 total capacity to equip a bunch of badges at once. And these things range from just very simple things like giving you an extra heart, which is just generally useful for survival, to much more complicated and specific stuff like making your ranged attacks fire explosive arrows, or making your melee attacks reach farther, or making you drink your healing flasks faster. So these badges, in addition to your equipment, are what really makes your build what it is. And as far as weaponry goes, there's 3 different types of weapons. There's melee weapons, ranged weapons, and magic weapons. And each one has its own various quirks and mechanics associated with it, and there's a vast amount of weaponry of each kind. There's like over 200 weapons in this game, many of which are crafted from various bits and bobs that you'll find around the world, and oftentimes from other weapons that you can then continue to improve. The weapons in this game are genuinely very fun to use, they're quite satisfying, and obviously it would be kind of silly to say that the combat is the high point of this game, because the combat is almost what you're doing all the time. Basically, this game is combat, so it seems silly to say it that way, but really all of the various bits of weaponry that you can find and just trying out new stuff is definitely the high point of the combat of this game, because it is it's a variety-focused combat system. It's focused on finding and trying out all sorts of new stuff. There's also an upgrade character back at the first main town that you can go to. You can fast travel back there, and you can upgrade any of the weapons that you're currently equipped with for gold. And you can upgrade each weapon all the way up to +5, which will generally increase its damage for the first 4 levels, and then the 5th level will increase its fire rate. You also have healing flasks, I mentioned, and you might be thinking this is going to be like an Estus-like system, and you're technically correct, but I do appreciate the fact that this game actually does something a little bit different with it. So it works in the sense that you would think you have a certain number of charges of healing flasks. As you beat bosses of the dungeon, you will get more and more charges so they can use it more times, and you can also find these things called mega plums while exploring, and you can give them to a cook back at the main first town, and he will upgrade the potency of your healing flasks for an increasing number of plums each time. And you have to hold the heal button to actually drink your flask. But the way that it works is a little bit different than what you might expect, because when you first hold the button, you'll see this flask symbol above your head filling up, and then you'll see the flask symbol emptying. And if you let go of the heal button before the flask fills up, you'll simply cancel the heal, keep the flask charge, and allow yourself to like dodge or whatever you needed to do. But if you let go of the button once the flask has started emptying, it consumes the charge and you heal, but the amount you heal depends on how empty that flask is when you actually release the button. If you hold it the whole time, then you'll get the full heal, but if you cancel early, this allows you to cancel out of the heal while still getting some health from it, but you do consume a charge of your flasks with like less efficiency. So it's kind of an interesting spin on the Estus-like healing system, giving you the opportunity to cancel out of the heal early but receive less healing as a result. There's also a ton of enemy variety in this game, with each biome having its own set of enemies and each dungeon having its own set of enemies as well. The dungeons don't just use the enemies of that biome, they also introduce new ones as well. So this game it's just very variety focused in general. It seems like every facet of it very much it thrives on its variety. And this means that the game has a really nice sense of challenge, because it doesn't feel like any particular area overstays its welcome. You're never in a biome for so long that you get tired of its enemies, and dungeons are relatively quick. So this means that by the time you've learned that particular area's enemy patterns and all of their bullet hell techniques that they'll use against you, you're already moving on to the next one, which is going to have its own new set of enemies in it as well. So this means that from the very beginning all the way up until the very last boss fight of the game, which is a big 3-phase boss fight that's quite challenging, you're constantly facing new challenges in general. You never really stay in one area for long enough to get bored, I guess you could say. This game keeps you moving at a pretty nice pace and always is able to give you new stuff, new armor, new weapons, new recipes, new towns, new enemies, new bosses, always with the variety giving you new challenges all the time. And I think that's a really good bit of pacing to make the game. It's not a short game per se. I would consider like about 9 hours or so a relatively good sized experience for like a small indie game. That's not really short in my opinion, not for this style of thing, but it means that the pacing is really, really good. So the actual game length isn't so much the point as the fact that it's very well paced and feels consistently challenging and varied the whole way through. Overall, I'd say Archvale is a genuinely very good experience. It is a very fun bullet hell RPG that has a lot going for it and tons of really fun and creative weapons to use and some super fun boss fights to challenge and some really cool areas to explore. It's just a nice variety-focused game that's bright and colorful and enjoyable and pretty challenging as well. It definitely gets more difficult in the later half. Once you reach places like the jungle, it really starts to ramp up how many bullets are on screen at a time and how creative they get with each enemy's bullet patterns, and the later bosses get pretty challenging. So this is definitely one to look at if you're a fan of this sort of thing. If you enjoy bullet hell games, or if you enjoyed Into the Gungeon, or if you enjoyed Terraria, it is similar in enough ways to make it a very satisfying variety-focused experience. So the link will, as always, be in the description below this video if you would like to check out the Steam store page. The game is only $15, which is pretty cheap and cheerful for this sort of thing in my opinion, and it is absolutely worth your time, although I would like to see some sort of update adding maybe like a New Game Plus with some more difficult stuff to challenge and some new like post-game content to enjoy and new recipes and stuff like that. I think it would be really cool to see a sort of a New Game Plus. Games like this are rife for that sort of thing when they're relatively quick to beat and have this much content to experience that you often want to jump back in and craft some new crazy post-game stuff. So I'd like to see that if possible. But yeah, that's Archvale. It's a really good time, honestly, and it kept me engaged the whole way through, which is why I basically 100%ed it. So thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.